started here. And we are recording this, but I'm gonna. So we are recording this webinar. Just wanted to let everybody know that. We will just take a couple of minutes here to introduce the event and our speakers, and then we'll be turning it over to them. So thanks very much, everyone, for being here. I want to mention that you should use the Q&A primarily if you have questions. We may have a little bit of time at the end of the session for questions rather than the chat. So we'll leave the chat open, but we're gonna kind of hold off on those things until the end of the session, okay? So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I'm Jennifer Borland. I'm the director of the Humanities Initiative. And today's event is sponsored by the Humanities Initiative. But I'm excited to say that we are now in the process of transitioning to a new phase with a new name. And we will eventually be called, moving into a title called the Center for the Humanities. So this is something that's really exciting and a recent development. Our mission will continue to focus on increasing the visibility of the humanities on campus and fostering new collaborative research. And you can go learn more about us at our website, and I'll put, thank you, Sarah Milligan has posted in the chat our website where you can find out more about our activities, and you can also find our email there, which you can use to get added to our email list. We have a couple of events coming up that I want to make sure you know about, and you can also find information about that on our website. Folklorist Dr. Andrea Kitta from East Carolina University will be giving a lecture called Bat Soup and Signs of the Beast, COVID Legends and Conspiracy Theories on March 1st, 3:30 to 4:30. At the moment, that's planned in person. And she will also be leading a workshop talking to others about COVID vaccine, how to discuss legends, rumors, and conspiracy theories with your loved ones, which would be on Wednesday, March 2nd. And that requires registration, so you can do that through our website as well. And we have two other events, virtual events this semester that feature new faculty in the arts and humanities at OSU. Those are on Wednesday, February 23rd and Thursday, March 24th. We've also had one of those already. This is the second and third of that series. All right, so let's move on to today's activities. Today's event is a conversation between Dr. Brandy Thomas-Wells and 3 students who were enrolled in her course, Digital Methods in History, in fall 2020. That's right, yeah, the semester, okay. A course in which the students contributed to the new digital resource, Women of Black Wall Street. The project educates visitors about women's contributions to Historic Greenwood, the thriving Black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And as I mentioned earlier, for those who maybe have just joined us, we're going to hold off on any questions till the end of our session, but if you have them, you can put them in the Q&A rather than the chat. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers. So Dr. Brandy Thomas-Wells is a historian of United States history with specializations in African American and women and gender histories. Her research interests especially center on the activities of African American women in various organizations. And she is currently writing a book, her first book, on African American women's internationalism through civic and social organizations, the United Nations, and the State Department. Dr. Wells's essays have also appeared in Origins and Women and Social Movements in Modern Empire. And she was recently awarded 3 university awards, including the Dr. Patricia Bell Inclusive Excellence Award, the Women's Faculty Council Rising Star Award for Mentorship, and the Award for Excellence in Advancement of OSU's Land Grant Mission. And now I would like to introduce our 3 former students. Trader Johnston received his bachelor's in history and philosophy from OSU in fall 2021. His future plans are to utilize his understanding in those fields along with digital methods to make information more readily available and accessible. Piper Reese graduated from OSU in fall of 2021 with a Bachelor of Science in Multimedia Journalism. During her undergraduate degree, she was a photojournalist for the Ocali, producer of the daily Daily O newscast, and marketing director for Camp Cowboy. Currently, she works for the Spears School of Business as a multimedia producer, creating video, photo, and podcast content for the school. Elizabeth Thomas is a senior in history. She has applied to several grad schools, but if that doesn't work out, she plans to get an emergency teaching certification and teach history at the secondary education level. Eventually, she would like to earn her PhD in US history and teach at the university level. And I think with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Wells. Thanks everyone again for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Borland, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Before we launch into our discussion, I want to offer a few remarks and reflections about the project. And I want to begin by honoring Nancy Randolph Davis, whose contributions to the OSU community we commemorate on this day annually. Like the women who are pictured in Women of Black Wall Street, Davis came of age in a time of legalized segregation in the nation and Oklahoma. In 1949, she became the first African-American student at Oklahoma State University. And though she gained admission, she was not permitted to sit in the classroom with her peers due to Oklahoma law. Instead, her seat was often placed in the hallway where she struggled to hear lectures, and certainly she could not be an active participant in class discussions. Despite these handicaps, Davis persevered as a student. After making the second highest score on a test, her white classmates petitioned their professor to allow her to sit in the classroom with them. The instructor relented and allowed Davis to enter, where she had to sit in the back of the classroom, with the understanding that anytime a university administrator came by, she was to return to the hallway. When asked how she endured all of this on campus, but more broadly in her community at a time when Black Americans were lynched, beaten, and Jim Crowed, Davis told of how she drew inspiration from Ada Scipio Fisher, who took up a Supreme Court case to enter the law school at the University of Oklahoma. She then immediately remarked, and I quote, "I was not trying to make history. I merely wanted an education. After receiving my bachelor's degree at Langston University, I wanted to attend OSU for my master's degree, since OSU had been one of the best home economic programs in the state. I didn't feel that I should have to leave the state to accomplish that. I knew that God was on my side and that with hard work and perseverance, I would prevail." Excuse me. As a scholar of African-American history, I was struck by Davis's and Fisher's story and the lived experiences of many Black women in Oklahoma. Like these women, the women that we studied in the Women of Black Wall Street, they were not trying to make history. They were working to care for themselves and their families and to tend to the needs of their community. And so when I arrived at OSU in 2018, 3 years before the centennial commemoration of the Tulsa race massacre, I knew that I wanted to leverage my expertise in Black women's history and do a very small part in recovering the richness and the resiliency of the Greenwood community. And I began this work alone between teaching classes and writing my first book. But very happily, when Elizabeth Thomas, who you will hear from today, joined me in an independent honors section, I convinced her to join my work. And I am grateful that she did. She brought immense talent to the project. And in the fall of 2020, Elizabeth shared with our colleagues in our digital methods class in history, our digital methods in history class rather, the work that we were doing. And the class was small, it was just 6 students, but it was mighty, and they eagerly joined the project. And they brought with them talents from not just history, but journalism and philosophy. And it really just enriched the project. And so 3 of them are here, but I also want to thank Michaela Swanson, Autumn Reese, and Kelsey Briggs for their invaluable contributions to the site. And you can read the biographies that they wrote, as well as these students' blogs on the website. To date, the site has amassed nearly 10,000 views from around the world. People have used it for their individual education, But also several teachers and faculty members have written to me personally to share that they have added it to their syllabi and are using it in their classes. And so I am happy, I am thrilled to chat with 3 members of the inaugural bunch and to invite other students who are here today to join me in future classes as we continue this important work. And I invite you to bring your talents to bear in Women of Black Wall Street. So with that, I'd like to take a moment to allow the other panelists to tell us more about yourselves. Why did you decide to take a class in digital methods in history?
I can start. So I took the class for 2 major reasons. First, I'm a history major, obviously, and I was really interested in the concept of digital history and just the tools and opportunities that it offers to historians, and just like how it might change the way we understand history as a society. And then also, whenever I was signing up for classes, Sarah, our advisor, told me that Dr. Wells was planning on focusing on the Tulsa Race Massacre, and I was really interested to learn more about it, since despite the fact that I grew up in Oklahoma, I knew basically nothing. So yeah.
I can go ahead and go next. Kind of along the same vein for what Elizabeth said, I took it because it's a major requirement. You know, I did study history, but over the course of my degree, that's kind of what it's transformed into, is my main goal being to want to use digital methods as a way of kind of like creating a vessel, you know, for history and things like that, just to make things more accessible. So that's another reason why I was majorly interested in a class like this. And I definitely did learn a great ordeal. It was definitely fun to work in. Honestly, looking over our project, it's been a while since I've taken a look at it. It's interesting to see how far it's come, for sure. I definitely didn't think that something so small, especially, you know, classwork of all things, would grow to be something so substantial.
So I'm a little bit different since I'm not a history major. I was enrolling for classes in the fall, and my advisor had actually sent me a flyer for Dr. Wells's class, and it mentioned the Tulsa Race Massacre. Well, growing up in Oklahoma, I've always been interested in Oklahoma history. I've wanted to enrich it. I continue to try to enrich Oklahoma history as much as possible. So I had actually forwarded the same flyer to my friend Kelsey Riggs, who also took this class. And we both decided we really wanted to take this class and learn more about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And we had actually had some experience with the applications that we use in Dr. Wells's class, because one of our other classes deals with data. Since journalism, we deal with a lot of data. So we were able to help out and use our knowledge of gathering data to help out the class. And I was really excited about learning more about the Tulsa Race Massacre, because I grew up in small town Oklahoma, and we barely learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Excellent. We'll circle back and talk about what you knew about the massacre before you came into the class. But first, let's reflect a little bit on the methods and the tools that we studied. Like we worked, tried our hand at big data, metadata, blogging, podcasting, infographics, story mapping, along with a number of other methods. And so which of those tools was the most rewarding? Tools or methods, the most rewarding, but also the most challenging for you to learn?
I think for me, the most challenging and rewarding was big data. So if I'm remembering correctly, our big data project was where we were given a website that would generate basically like a bundle of tweets on different topics. And so I did like masking and the 1918 Spanish influenza epidemic, and got like I think around 1,000 tweets. And so it was really difficult, like just in the sense of I'm not very good with technology, which is also part of the reason why I took a digital history course, because I wanted to grow. So I had a hard time doing the actual technical work of getting the program that we were supposed to be using to function. But then also in interpretation, trying to like sift through all of the information that was there and put together a coherent argument was definitely challenging, but also I think very exciting and worth it to my skills as a historian. So.
Yeah, I definitely believe challenging. I want to say big data was a rough one. Also, working with maps, our spatial information, was pretty interesting. Definitely not maybe the easiest thing that I've done. I think the most rewarding and probably the most fun was working with infographics. Infographics, I definitely think, are just kind of an interesting way to learn, especially for those that might be more inclined to, visual learning over the more traditional method. And they offer a lot more expressiveness, I guess, artistically. They can be as simple or as complicated as you want them to be. So working with that and was definitely a new medium for me. And I think it's one that I found the most interesting for sure.
For me, I'm going to kind of echo everyone else. The big data, the metadata, it was very daunting. It was so big. It was just, for me, when we did the Twitter analysis, I think I made my ranges too broad. So I had over 1 million tweets. So I had to figure out how to kind of condense that and try to figure out how to be more specific. The most rewarding for me would be the podcasting, because obviously that's my job now. That's what I do. But I loved doing the podcast, being able to just kind of talk with my friends about the Tulsa Race Massacre and being able to edit those podcasts to make it for people to listen to it, basically.
Yeah, let's take a moment and talk about those podcasts, because I remember listening to everybody's podcast on here. You all took a different approach, and they were just so good. So can you talk a little bit about what you did in the podcast? I remember Piper and Kelsey actually did a conversation together. Elizabeth, you did an interview, and Trader, I think you also did a conversation. So can you talk a little bit about what you did in those podcasts?
Yeah, so for my podcast, I talked with a fellow classmate, Kelsey Briggs. We were both multimedia journalism majors. We also both grew up in small town Oklahoma. She was Southwestern and I was Northern Oklahoma. So we kind of just compared our experiences hearing about the Tulsa Race Massacre. I talked about when I was in high school, I learned about it, but not a whole lot. And she talked about how she didn't even learn it in high school. She learned it from an ex-boyfriend now. Because he lived in Tulsa at the time, and he just was like, hey, we should go to Greenwood, like this happened here. And she was like, why is this not taught? Like, why is this not a thing? So that was kind of like what our podcast was around.
Along a similar vein, mine was the same way. I actually gathered, I want to say it was 3 or 4 people that I know pretty personally, all also native, I don't know about native, but at least grew up in Oklahoma, especially in southern Oklahoma, kind of near the Gainesville border-esque. And that was a lot that we talked about, was just kind of how we are educated in, say like middle school or high school about these topics, and why similar events such as these aren't really taught, or if they are taught, they're glazed over, especially, with some kind of like the more details that I've learned throughout this, and kind of comparing them with knowledge from people that are outside of a class such as these was definitely interesting to see, the contrast and perspective there.
For my podcast, I, like Dr. Wells mentioned, oh goodness, sorry, the light just turned off on me, and it's back. I interviewed a friend of mine who grew up in small town Oklahoma, and I grew up in kind of more like central, not like quite, well, yeah, like Oklahoma City area, so like bigger city. And we kind of compared our educational backgrounds and what we had learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre growing up, which was a very interesting study because he actually knew more about it than I did, which if you think like stereotypical assessments of education, you wouldn't think that like a small town education would be more thorough than one that you would get in like a bigger city, but it was. And so I thought that was really fascinating, just kind of discussing like the disparities between our educations and how a lot of stuff like this that's not written into nationally recognized textbooks is up to the personal discretion of your teacher.
I would add, and thank you so much, Sarah, for putting those links in the chat. You all should check out those podcasts and then check out their blog posts, because with those podcasts, they did intro and outro music. They wrote a script. They had to, I think you only had 10 to 15 minutes, like 15 minutes max. Sometimes the conversations were an hour, so they were having to tweak these recordings. And so it really is rewarding for you all to go and listen to. And I actually look forward to using those podcasts in my Oklahoma history class this semester. So thank you all so much for those reflections. Let's move on to talk about the theme of the course, the Tulsa Race Massacre. And you all have mentioned so far that, you knew a little bit about the massacre, or you didn't know anything. Can you specifically go into what had you learned about the massacre? Was it called a massacre, or was it called a riot? What did you go in knowing? How it started, how it ended? Let's get into some specifics, and then we'll talk in a few minutes about what you learned in the class. So just go back and think about what you knew coming in to the course.
Yeah, so I'll start off. I remember specifically, I took Oklahoma history my freshman year of high school, and we had first learned about Native American history just because I grew up in Osage County. So I learned about the heritage of Native Americans, and then it moved on to the Tulsa Race Riot is what they called it. And I think we only spent a day and a half on it. Really, what I remember from it was a Black man, entered an elevator, was accused of touching a girl inappropriately, came out of the elevator, and from there was basically he almost was hung, from what I remember, what my teacher told me. And there was a whole riot. That was the whole thing. There was a whole riot about it. And before the riot happened, Black Wall Street was a thing, and the Black community was thriving. It was the most successful community in Oklahoma history, from what I was told. So that's kind of how I grew up, knowing what the Tulsa Race Riot was, before I knew it was called the Tulsa Race Massacre, because it wasn't necessarily a riot.
Yes, a similar vein, honestly, in primary education, I want to say our time was even less than that. The whole breadth, I want to say, on the topic itself was a paragraph in my Oklahoma history textbook. This is, I want to say, 9th grade Oklahoma history, which summed up was about a sentence or two. And of course, it was referred to as, the race riots. It wasn't in depth at all, not how it happened, not really, more so focused on its result. But even then, that explanation was kind of marginal. So I did know a little bit more about it just from kind of like happenstance, not really searching out that information, but, just kind of like coming across some facts and some other things about it. So, but I mean, even then, going into this course, my knowledge of it definitely, I want to say, was bare minimum for sure, which is kind of a shame, especially living in this state, and of course being someone of color. I feel like that's something that I should really kind of be pertinent towards, but it is a product of the environment, I suppose.
Yeah, so kind of similar vein as the other two, but as far as I remember, which my memory isn't that great, but as far as I remember, I actually don't think I learned about the massacre in school. I heard about it through a family friend who like mentioned it offhand one time whenever we were having a discussion about history when I was like 11 or 12. And what I had heard was that basically like there was an incident in an elevator, and then part of Tulsa was burned to the ground. And that's really all I knew. So yeah.
One of the things we talked about in the class is even as there was a growing conversation around the massacre, it would only focus on the events themselves, right? And not on Greenwood as a community. And so that's one of the things that we wanted to do. And so in the course, we read a number of materials, printed, but also digital. Can you talk about what you learned in the course about the massacre, but also more broadly about the Greenwood community? What were some of the takeaways for you?
For me, I think one of the first things I learned through the book, Randy Kribel's Tulsa 1921, that in high school, they said that like the Black community was thriving. It was like they were so rich. It was Black Wall Street. Well, come to find out, it wasn't really like that. It was just another Black community. It was just, they were just living. They were just, being themselves. And I think a lot of people, at least in my perspective, a lot of people glamorize Black Wall Street and say that like they were rich, they like had so much, they were like the richest like Black community, when in reality they just were trying to have their own community within Oklahoma, within Greenwood. That's kind of what I learned about. And then as the class went on, I remember, I believe it was 60 Minutes came out with a special about the Tulsa Race Massacre, talking to people from Greenwood, asking them questions about it. And a lot of them didn't really know it because they weren't taught about it in school. A lot of their ancestors, a lot of their grandparents died in the massacre, so they couldn't have that oral history or have someone tell them about it. So that was my main takeaway from the book was, Greenwood was just another community. It wasn't necessarily like this booming town, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and there was a lot of wealth there, but I think
Yeah.
what you're saying, Piper, is we don't have to flatten the story, right? We can also talk about working class people in Greenwood and what their experiences were like, right? Because if you want to understand how the massacre impacted people, you can understand how it impacted working class people, business owners, absolutely. And so we wanted to take a multi-dimensional look at Greenwood, absolutely. Trader or Elizabeth?
Yes, so definitely learning about Greenwood. I think the biggest thing that was kind of hammered home to me was just the carnality of kind of what went on. And similar to what, Piper was saying before, it was described as Black Wall Street, and all these people were, wealthy and were thriving and prominent. And with that story, at least in a lot of explanations I've seen, it's kind of painted, in a jealous light, which is kind of one of the reasons why, Greenwood and the whole community was destroyed, which really, with what I learned in this class and some other things, that's just not really the right reason. It was definitely more prejudice focused. I mean, it was more hatred focused. It was outright destruction. And a bunch of explanations are really, kind of described as, the loss of Black wealth in, America or in Oklahoma, or just some other things that are kind of tied to, racist interactions. And it's not really punctuated in the right way, because I mean, it's more than the loss of wealth. It's people, losing their businesses, losing their families, losing their futures, disappearing from, what history they have, to be scattered all over the state and beyond. And that's just something that didn't really click with me until I had taken a course like this.
Yeah, I think kind of going off of what Trader said, another one of the really, I don't know what the right word to use here is, but like the way that Oklahoma, and especially Tulsa at the time, was like kind of a pressure cooker of tension at the moment that everything erupted. Like if you think about the context, it's 1921, so World War ended only 2 years previous, and there were, 10,000 Black troops who were coming home, and they, a lot of veterans were treated with disdain despite the fact that they went abroad to fight for their country. And so there was kind of this tension between Black soldiers coming home and saying, I just fought for my country, and now I'm being treated like a second-class citizen. And people who looked at that and said, like, who were white supremacists and who didn't want to see, you know, the uplifting of the race. And they were doing everything they could to quell it. So like in summer of 1919 is the Red Summer, and there are race riots or massacres all over the country. And then you get to Greenwood and it's already a place of intense jealousy because the Black community is thriving and self-sufficient. You know, everything that they need that they wouldn't be able to get from the white community, they just built themselves. And I think the most intense part of the tragedy for me was the way that like Greenwood never really recovered. Like the people were tenacious. They definitely had that like spirit of surviving and thriving. But and even though like the physical place was rebuilt within the decade, it like never was able to get back up to the cultural centrality that it once had. For Black Americans. I mean, so many people left and went to California, and people like don't talk about it. It left such an intense scar mentally and emotionally as well as physically.
You all have said a lot. Elizabeth started moving into this conspiracy of silence that is around the massacre, right? And the fact that we haven't talked about it enough. Maybe we'll get a question about that in the Q&A. I want to shift now to thinking about and talking about the work that you did. So can you tell us about the biography that you wrote, the woman whose life you worked to recover? What did you discover about this person?
So the woman that I did my research on was named Irene Evans. Unfortunately, I wasn't really able to pull up a whole lot of concrete data. You know, at first I thought that kind of might be an issue with my methods or the way that I was conducting my research, but unfortunately, it's just the case that not a whole lot exists for this woman, which is a shame because it turns out, you know, she was like a very prominent member of Greenwood. You know, she owned multiple businesses, her and her husband both. And, you know, she was a prominent member of the community, you know, in church and in social circles and just in a bunch of other functions. So that was one of the big lessons to me, was being able to do, you know, the hours of research for, you know, someone who would be fairly prominent, especially, you know, in a community in the 1920s, but short of, you know, finding her name on some business ads and, you know, a couple church articles, there's not a whole lot on this woman, which, you know, like I said, was a lesson in of itself.
Yeah, and Irene Evans, if I recall correctly, she was a cafe owner and trader. This was the second person. Remember the first person that you researched, we just had to let it go because you couldn't find anything at all.
Yes.
We're able to find some stuff on Irene Evans. Would you like to say a little bit about that?
It was definitely interesting. I mean, one, just because it's kind of like the first time that I've really delved into something like this. And two, you know, as compared to most of the ways that you might search for information, you know, using like online libraries or search engines or whatever, I definitely feel like I had to get nitty and gritty doing this, you know, like I'm scanning PDFs of newspapers from 100 years ago. And, you know, I'm looking through, you know, scanned in and digitized documents for, you know, like municipal records, like housing information, trying to find a way for public access to maybe find, you know, deeds or something along those lines with similar names. And being able to find anything, it was a light in the dark for sure. So finding anything on Evans, and apologize, but I'm not quite sure if I remember the name of the woman before, but being able to, from finding nothing to being able to find something, even though, you know, it was very little, even then that was like a wow kind of thing.
Yeah. And everyone, Trader researched Irene Evans, who was the owner of the Evans Cafe. And I remember that after 1918, the trail on her went cold, right? And so you were finding all of this stuff before the massacre. And this is just one of those examples where we don't know what happened to her, right? Or her husband, or the Evans family after the massacre, right? And so maybe someone else who takes the class in the future can pick up where Trader left off and see if we can discover anything about Irene Evans. Piper or Elizabeth?
So I kind of had the same problem that Trader had. I really don't remember who I had because she was also a diner or cafe owner. We tried to pin down the name of the cafe, but I couldn't find any records of it actually existing. So I just tried going off of family members or relatives. And that was also spotty too, because there was a couple different family lineages that I could have gone off of, but I couldn't narrow down which one was the correct one. So I also had the same troubles. And it's been so long, I cannot remember for the life of me, and I feel terrible about it.
You didn't have Susie Bale, did you? I think that was.
I don't think I did, because Susie Bell, you could find like her stuff you could find. I could not find anyone on me. And it was very frustrating for me because I was searching and searching and searching and searching through everything. And I just came up nothing.
What about you, Elizabeth?
Yeah, so since I worked with Dr. Wells doing like an honors contract and as an intern, I wrote like 4 or 5 different biographies, but the first one I did was probably the most impactful for me. It was Mary Elizabeth Jones Parrish. And Parrish, you know, she was born in Mississippi, she moved to Oklahoma, she moved to New York, she came back to Oklahoma. She founded 2 different schools, she was a teacher. And on the night of the massacre, she ended up fleeing north of Tulsa with her 7-year-old daughter, Florence. And whenever she returned, she was sought out by this Reverend H.T.S. Johnson, who was heading up the interracial commission that formed following the massacre. And he asked her to write a book about, or to do some reporting about the massacre. And so she wrote a book called The Events of the Tulsa Disaster, which is, if you're going to study the Tulsa Race Massacre, you can't not read this book. It is the source. It's a primary source, but it's also a history, and it's she wrote her own story, and she also collected a long series of firsthand accounts from survivors. And she has a partial list of damages incurred by businesses, including a list of where the businesses were. So whenever we went to build our map, that was really important in finding that. And she also had like a bunch of ads that she reprinted for various businesses in the area. So I think her story was just so fascinating to me because like she was so important to the story, like she's so important to the story of Greenwood, but it's not the person, like a teacher, and at this point we believe a single mom in the 1920s is like really not the person like you would pick out to be kind of the historian. Which I think is really beautiful whenever you're studying history, the people who come up as central to the story. So yeah.
Yeah, and to add to that, Elizabeth did a wonderful job with that Parrish biography, and Parrish was covered in the New Yorker, right? And one of the main conversations in the Tulsa Race Massacre. And Elizabeth just did a really good job of discovering what Parrish's life was about. Trader with Irene Evans, Piper Reese with her biography, but then we also did Susie Bale. I think we did Blanche Ashford. We had a newspaper writer. Do you all remember, or what do you remember walking away with as we focused on Black women in Greenwood, right? That focus on Black women business owners. What did you walk away with?
I think one of the things that doing women's history, especially doing Black women's history, is sort of like being a detective, or because I mean, until less than 40 years ago, Black women's history was not a field. And so doing this research is really tough because a lot of their stories aren't preserved. And especially with women's genealogical history, I think that was the toughest thing was like women take the surnames of their husbands. And so finding their names in the records, like either finding them under their maiden name or finding them like under their married name after the massacre, like it was just a really it was a tough case of having to dig. And but you also see, like, especially in women's history and Black women's history, like this tenacity of women and the way that women build kinship networks. Like you don't learn about one of these women without also learning about another woman that lived in Greenwood, because they were the sense of community was so strong in the sense that like they can't survive without each other, which I think is just a really beautiful testament to human nature.
Yes, definitely in a similar vein, because this is one of the first few projects that I worked on that really did focus on, Black women, and especially in America, that resilience and that tenacity, I think is just something that has been hammered home time and again, especially going through and, doing the work for some of these biographies and reading, some of the excerpts and testaments from either Tulsa 1921 or some other repositories, definitely just kind of hammered home how strong a person and a community can really become. And that was one of the takeaways. Also, that it's just not an easy field to study at all. Like Elizabeth said, it hasn't been a field for very long, especially compared to, some of your other generic fields of historical study. And that has made it interesting because it feels a little new, like it feels a little more refreshing, but it's also difficult to do that research, because of the scarcity of the material behind it.
Yeah, I know a lot. I know I said it throughout the class the entire semester. I'm not a historian. I am trying my best as a journalist to try to figure out kind of finding history. And I hit a lot of stumps. Thanks to Elizabeth Trader and a lot of other people in my class, I was able to find some history, but still got stumped because Black women, like they said, I'll echo, their history, it was hard because women's history alone, but Black women's history was hard to find back in the day and to trace back anything. So again, that was like a big challenge for me, was trying to be patient and trying to find all the information, trying to do it accurately.
You all did a really remarkable job. When you look at the website, what's your favorite part? Do you like the maps, the recipes, the background essays? What do you like, and what do you think how do you think users will benefit by visiting that particular component of the site?
I believe I'm definitely a bit biased on the biographies. I genuinely think, because compared to some other repositories that I've looked at, I think definitely believe it's kind of the most unique thing that we've done to kind of recreate the lives, that these people lived, and more importantly, the effect that the massacre had on these people. So that is just the thing that kind of stands out to me the most. Also, our use of visual data, I'm just really impressed, both with Elizabeth and Michaela both. It is really well done. It's well executed, and having those sections for, current maps and maps of Greenwood at the time, for, like I said, for people who do learn visually, that just really kind of helps to further build the image in their mind. And I feel like it just really helps hammer the whole theme of the repository home.
For me, if you guys haven't had a chance to look at the website, my favorite part of it are the essays, the background essays and after the massacre essays. Specifically, the one that I worked on was Black in Oklahoma. essentially like Oklahoma history is Black history, because from what I kind of gathered in like all the data that I found, there were quite a few Black communities in Oklahoma. And I didn't know that before coming into this class. So kind of researching that, that's been my favorite part, and just kind of reading over the Black history in Oklahoma, how many towns there actually were, what settlements kind of ended up in Oklahoma, and what actually stuck in Oklahoma. I believe there's only 13 towns that are still in existence from Black settlers. So I would say the background essays and the after the massacre essays are really good because it gives you a lot of detail before the massacre and after the massacre of what happened. A couple other essays that are in it are Women of Greenwood, or the Womanhood of Greenwood, Manhood of Greenwood, and then the History of American Race Riots. I really liked reading those, and I liked getting the background information on that.
Yeah, I think kind of going back to what Trader said, the maps part of the website is really awesome. And Michaela did a lot of like really tough work on that part of the website. So definitely give it some love, but I'm biased as well. I love the biographies part of the page for a couple of reasons. For the technical fun of the like picture or clicking the links, like if you haven't visited the website, the way it kind of works is you get 10 pictures with names on them and you click on them and it takes you to the biography, which was really fun to like figure out how to do that. But also like for the significance of like the, I guess like just the significance to history that seeking out and telling these stories has, like Black women are such an underrepresented demographic when it comes to studying history. And that's what made this project and Dr. Wells' work so important, is that these stories of the women in Black Wall Street waiting to be told, like needed to be sought out and brought to light because they show not only what life was like in Greenwood, but also how humans are, and like how tenacity and these I guess like, sorry, I'm totally drawing a blank, but the way that humans change and evolve over time, but also the way that what we see in people who survive despite all obstacles, those characteristics remain the same. And I think that's really beautiful. So yeah.
Yeah, you all have laid out some of my favorite parts of the website. I want to thank Sean Thomas, a PhD student in the Department of Geography, for those historic maps, and Michaela, who really worked very hard on those contemporary maps. So make sure you check out the maps part of the website. But also there are some interviews there with contemporary Black women business owners in Greenwood. And so they reflect on what it means to own a business in Greenwood today. And then there's a famous recipe from Susie Bale, her smothered, I think it was smothered chicken recipe. So make sure to check that out. Before we open up for question and answers, or a Q&A, I have just one final question. If we had more time, right, an infinite amount of time to build the website, what would you have liked to be a part of the website?
So I'm a digital person. I love video. I love photos. I love doing it all. Our class was online this semester. And I know at one point, Dr. Wells had mentioned if it was in person, we were going to take a trip down to Greenwood. It would have been so fun. I personally would have loved to have done a comparison to Greenwood now from when it was back then using old photos. I did find some footage actually from one of the public libraries, I think. They had some footage of Black communities in Oklahoma, and they highlighted Greenwood after the massacre. And there were photos before the massacre as well, but I really would have loved to highlight a comparison of before and after the massacre, or before and after then and now, basically.
In that same vein, I really would have loved to see, like, we have the historic maps, which are awesome, but I think going more in depth into those and creating like an interactive map, especially one that you can see the change over time of how Greenwood of what Greenwood looked like, because I think one of the pitfalls of studying Greenwood and the Tulsa Race Massacre is there's kind of like two time periods. It's Greenwood then, and then the massacre, and maybe Greenwood now, but like there's not really, there were 100 years between the massacre and today. So like seeing how it changed over time, how the community rebuilt and shifted, I think that would be a really beautiful way, a really interesting project.
No, it's going to sound like an echo chamber in here, but I definitely think that maps and visual information is one of the things that I would have liked to focus on if we did have more time. You know, how you said both having present and, you know, previous maps, so you can really get the feeling of the change that took place. I also would have honestly liked to add more, I'm not sure about biographies, but just a way to represent some of the other women in Greenwood, you know, maybe necessarily some on the younger side, you know, maybe, you know, Black girls in Greenwood, or, you know, those making that transition into adulthood, as well as some who, you know, might not have been business owners, or who might have been maybe less prominent members of the community that, you know, still saw their lives changed in such a way.
Yeah.
Before I turn it over to Dr. Borland, let me take a moment to shout out Trader's background essay on Black masculinity in Oklahoma, right? So you can't understand what the lives of Black women was in Oklahoma, were like in Oklahoma, unless you understand what their relationships were to Black men. So make sure you check out that background essay as well. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Oh, I was just going to say, along that same vein, I think one of the things that was really hard about this project was we really wanted to do a more like diverse class representation of women in Greenwood, but like researching prominent business women in Greenwood was already extremely difficult. So even finding records of like domestics and other sort of like working class women was really, really difficult, even though we really would have wanted to. So yeah, I think that's just one of the unfortunate realities of history.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for mentioning that. At this time, I'll turn it over to Dr. Borland for any questions that we may have from the audience.
Yeah, so we've already gotten a few questions. Feel free to put questions in the Q&A. And we also have a couple already in the chat. So I am going to take a quick turn on those. So the first one is from Dr. Griswold, who says, "You all are amazing." And the question is, how did you navigate the sense of responsibility that comes with working on such a vital history? It is incredible what you have done. It is also so crucial. And so in short, what is it like to work on a project with such important stakes?
I am by nature not a very careful person, in the sense that I tend to be very clumsy, and my words are clunky. So whenever I was writing these histories, I think the thing that was always on my mind was, how do I represent this in like the best possible light and the most like sensitive way, in the sense of like I'm being really careful and thorough and really giving all of these women that I'm researching the attention and detail that they deserve. And so making sure that I don't rush through anything, and that also, you know, being a white woman, that whenever I'm considering Black history, that I am taking into consideration all of the like sensitivities that come with that, and the impact that it has on communities today. So
I would also kind of echo Elizabeth on that. I kind of agree with that too. For me, as a multimedia journalism, I guess, graduate now, we were taught to always to report accurately, don't leave anything out, just kind of that sense. So for me, it was the accuracy of everything. I didn't want to report something that wasn't accurate. So for me, like the biographies, like I mentioned, were hard for me because there were a lot of different leads. So I didn't know which one was the right one. And it was really hard to kind of figure out on that sense. But for me, it would be like reporting accurately.
Yes, I believe it. I'm honestly not quite sure how to put it into words. I will be frank. This class and this project took place, during a time where I had a lot of other things going on. So unfortunately, I didn't really get to put as much work into this project as I would have enjoyed, especially seeing, how big of a resource it's turned out to be. That being said, I still, even in, I guess, the most bare minimum sense, wanted to get it right. So I, kind of how Piper said, I wanted to make sure that things were accurate, which is, kind of a problem of why, getting such veritable, research was such an effort. But that is one of the things that I believe that was really important, was to make sure that things are accurate, not both in information, but in tone, to be able to tell the story how, I guess, I believe that it most accurately would have played out, and not really to use that information in a way that might paint it in any other, sort of light that I didn't believe was authentic. So getting it right, but also getting it authentic, was very important.
I want to jump in here and say that I think you can hear from everyone's answers how they made my job that much easier, because they were so careful and so dedicated. And that dedication showed, because they know that they wrote multiple drafts of those biographies, right? And then even afterwards, before they went online, myself working with Elizabeth and my other digital intern, Michaela Swanson, we double checked and checked. We had the history department and other people across the campus looking at these essays and making sure that we were doing work that was responsible, or that is responsible, and that really contributes. And I want to add a final remark to really hammer home this point. Susie Bale, one of the women on the website, has a grandniece who is still living. Her name is Jennifer King. We interviewed her. We talked to her about the biography that would appear online, and we exchanged and talked about things that she wanted there and things that she did not. The same for Mary Elizabeth Jones Parrish. Her great granddaughter, Annalise Bruner, was making her rounds on the national landscape, talking about her great grandmother. And so sitting down, taking the time to talk to these living descendants about what we were putting online, and making sure that they were okay with it, and sharing with them some of the incredible things that we found, because it really did mean a lot to those families, right? Because we have resources as researchers that they don't necessarily have access to as members of the public, even when they're incredibly interested in their family history. And so, as one small example, I shared with Annalise Bruner that her great grandmother had actually left Oklahoma and lived in Muskogee and was a grocery store clerk right before she before she opened up a school, and she didn't know that. So we were able to share that. And so to me, that's what it means to do history at a time when all of the eyes in the nation and the world were on Oklahoma.
We have so many great questions, and we're probably only going to get to one more, but I think this is actually a really nice segue from what you were just talking about, Dr. Wells. So I want to ask the question about the impact, what you learned about the impact of the massacre over those 100 years. So some of you mentioned the brain drain that took place afterward. Did some descendants eventually return? How long did that process take? And so maybe that's a great sort of point on which to end our conversation. But if you all had any responses to that question.
Well, I'm honestly not sure. As far as the second part of that question goes, of course, like about some descendants returning, like Dr. Wells said, we do have the interviews portion of the website where some people have, kind of moved back into that area, or, they might be in the Greenwood area and are kind of interested on the, kind of the history and just the real culture, back what it was 100 years ago. So some people definitely have kind of returned to the area. some people didn't really go far. So there are some that kind of came back gradually over time. And of course, you know, evidence there are still some that are there today. As far as the brain drain part of that question, I'm not sure that I might be the best to answer that.
If no one else wants to jump in here, I just want to say this. One, take Oklahoma history with me and take another digital methods and history course, and we can talk about this. But I want to highlight this in just 1 or 2 minutes by pointing out Susie Bale, who was a powerful, multifaceted woman who owned a plethora of businesses. She never rebounded from the Tulsa Race Massacre. And her family, even today, talks about all of the generational wealth that was lost. Also, and Elizabeth, I think it was you who wrote about Emma Gurley. Yes. And O.W. Gurley, and they left and went to California, right? So these founders of Greenwood. Would you like to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I was just thinking about one facet of Emma Gurley's story is the night of the massacre, she and her husband were running and she fell and wasn't able to get up and told him to keep going. And then they reconnected later and then later moved to California. And I think that's just one of the things that it's difficult whenever you're writing history to forget not to intellectualize it. But just like for this wealth and like true thriving that existed in the community and seeing like all of that be crushed is just like beyond, I don't know, discouraging, I guess. It's just, yeah, sorry.
So if you take a class with me, I hope that you will see, we'll talk about how Greenwood remarkably rebuilt and how we really see that in the physical structure and people's lives. But we'll also talk about the remaining damages that Greenwood continued to suffer under, including the conspiracy of silence, right? And so we'll be able to unpack that and then talk about what happens when urban renewal, you know, comes and splits Greenwood in half. And so please take my course, my history courses, and also other history courses to find out about what happens in Greenwood 100 years after the massacre.
I think, unfortunately, we have to wrap up this discussion, but this was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing your thoughts. And thanks to all of you who are here attending and listening to this excellent conversation. And I would just encourage you, as Dr. Wells said, to take courses if you're students in these areas to learn more and become part of this project. And everyone should keep their eye on the website because it's going to keep developing and growing over time. And so I know there were a few other questions that we didn't quite get to. If anyone has any follow-up questions, I think you can contact either myself or Dr. Wells, and we can pass those along to the panelists and things like that. So thank you again, everybody. And thanks so much to all of you for being here to hear from our great panel. All right, I'm going to close it up. Bye-bye, everyone.